Our next lesson in speech is becoming a competent communicator. Our objective is to find and use the keys to communication competence. I'm going to read a definition and say a word. I want you to repeat the word after me. Capable, sufficient for the purpose, is competent. To assess the quality or value is evaluate. A standard of conduct or behavior is norm. The range of skills, aptitudes, or special accomplishments of a person or group is, let me click it,
Repertoire.
repertoire. All right. Go ahead and get your notes. Let's write today's date. And the name of our lesson is Becoming a Competent Communicator. Becoming a competent communicator. Have you ever thought about why some people can carry on a conversation more comfortably than others? Why you would rather listen to one speaker than another? Why you might have no difficulty following one teacher's directions but are unable to understand what another teacher expects of you? The answers to these questions involve communication competence. So the keys to communication competence. So we're going to talk about the keys to communication competence. One is know the requirements. Know the requirements. Communication competence is the ability to interact with others in a manner that is appropriate for the situation, the individuals involved, and the task. However, communication is not an exact science. You cannot simply follow a set of procedures to achieve communication competence. How you communicate with a person depends upon the information you need to communicate, your relationship with the person, and his or her background. For example, if you decided to move to another state, you might approach two good friends about the news in two totally different ways. Your first friend may be a very calm, confident person who would take the news straight on, allowing you to discuss the move openly and immediately. The second friend may have often depended upon you for connections to social functions and emotional support. You may have to carefully select the time, place, and manner in which you break the news to your second friend. By using the communication skills you learned about in this course, that is, listening, watching for cues, and making sound judgments on time, place, and manner of communication, you should be able to communicate your move to another state successfully to both friends. Competent communication requires knowledge, skill, and creativity. Not every competent communicator will have the same approaches to communication situations. It is the purpose of this course to enhance and broaden your communication skills, not dictate a style. The greater the number of communication choices available to you, the greater the likelihood that you'll be able to communicate more effectively. Okay. So this says that communication competence is the Communication competence is the ability to interact with others in a manner that is appropriate for the situation. Okay. Know the requirements. So we have to interact with others in a manner that is appropriate for the situation. in a manner that is appropriate for the situation, individuals, and task. Okay, so know the requirements. Just like the example, you have to be able to do it in an appropriate manner for the situation, the appropriate manner for the individuals, and the appropriate manner for the task. Allow situation to influence approach. Okay, so situation it just doesn't look right. Influences approach. As mentioned above, communication occurs in a variety of contexts. Two friends talking privately is considered interpersonal communication. The context of the situation provides a framework for the two friends to communicate. It also affects the roles that will be played. For example, two friends communicate by taking turns sharing information. One person does not sit silently while the other person engages in a formal monologue. Allowing only one person to be heard would not be appropriate for the situation. The context also influences the norms that govern interaction between people. If you have a job, consider how you talk to your employer versus your coworkers. If your employer asks you to give him an update on some work he has asked you to do, you'll probably respond in a formal manner, explaining the challenges and how you overcame them, telling him how far along you are. When talking with your coworkers, you may laugh about funny situations that occurred while you were working. You may admit a mistake or two you did that caused you to redo the work. Your communication with coworkers is much more informal than with your employer. In both cases, you would have considered your listener, your responsibility to him or her, and the consequence of your communication choices. With your employer, you would want to demonstrate your competence on the job. With your coworkers, you're interested in developing a more personal relationship that is based on camaraderie, trust, and friendship. To further illustrate that communication competence is influenced by situation, let's consider standards for conduct in a public setting versus a private setting. In private, people tend to be more open about their feelings. They're more apt to be open and show affection, whereas in public, conversation topics remain relatively impersonal and safe. Nothing is said that you wouldn't mind being repeated. Emotions are kept to a minimum, as well as displays of affection. With these standards in mind, it would be more considerate for a man to choose a comfortable private setting to pop the question, propose marriage, than to do so in an awkward public setting. Communication is more appropriate when it follows the standards set by the context. So let the situation influence the approach. Keep the situation in mind. Okay. Appropriate for the individuals. Appropriate for the individuals. Our communication competence is evaluated in terms of the person with whom you are communicating. Okay, let the situation influence, now the individuals. As you learned in the example of speaking to an employer versus your coworkers, how you communicate depends on who receives your communication. Everyone has different tiers or categories of acquaintances. Some people are your peers, others are your superiors, and others may look up to you for guidance. Okay, so you're going to have to change your interaction method depending on who receives the communication. Appropriate for the task. Okay, so the individuals are going to influence the approach. I hate to rewrite all this. No. Appropriate for individuals Now appropriate for the task. Successful communication occurs when people interact in a way that is considerate of others. If your brother interrupts you while you're talking to a friend on the phone, yelling at him may make you feel in control, but it might anger him and cause him to shout back at you, escalating the exchange. Instead, you could cover the mouthpiece on the phone and tell him you can talk to him as soon as you finish your phone conversation. If you talk to your brother in this second approach, he's more likely to leave you alone until you complete your call. Considering how the person might react to your words is a good way to anticipate communication success. There might be times, though, when you say all the right things but do not get what you are seeking. Communication is not an exact science because everyone comes to the act of communication with his or her own experiences. People can react in unpredictable ways and at times in an irrational manner. Consider the following situation between two friends. Michelle approaches Heather to invite her to see a new play that has just opened downtown. Heather has already heard about the play and decided it's not something she's comfortable seeing. However, Heather knows Michelle is sensitive, so she politely tells Michelle that the play doesn't sound like her cup of tea, but she's thankful for the invitation. Frustrated, Michelle replies, "You think you're too good to hang out with me, don't you?" Heather did as much as she could to consider Michelle's needs and her own, but she was unable to control Michelle's reaction. Heather can still be considered a competent or skilled communicator because she adequately communicated her response in a considerate manner. So whenever we communicate, we need to take the situation in mind, the individuals in mind, and the task in mind. Appropriate for individuals, I'm just going to put and task instead of writing it again. Okay, next, we need to make sure that we communicate honestly. Be honest. Nearly 400 years ago, Miguel de Cervantes penned one of the most often quoted sayings in the world, "Honesty is the best policy." That statement still holds true today. Competent communication requires honesty. Lying might get what you seek, but the successful result will be short-lived. Sooner or later, the truth will become known. The person to whom you lied will feel cheated and will doubt if he or she can trust you. Future attempts to communicate with the person will be tainted by your past dishonest behavior. However, competent communication does not insist on a person declaring the truth bluntly. Consider, for instance, a doctor who is faced with the task of informing a family that a family member has died during surgery. If telling the truth was the only concern, he might say she's dead. However, that approach would not be appropriate for the family. Most doctors would consider the family's feelings and tell him the truth about their family member in a way that shows respect and concern. So not only do we need to be honest, we need to be considerate of other people's feelings. Be honest and considerate of others' feelings. Okay, so today we're talking about becoming a competent communicator. The keys to being a competent communicator are: know the requirements, interact with others in a manner appropriate for the situation, individuals, and tasks. The situation influences the approach. We have to appropriate for individuals and appropriate for the task. Be honest and considerate of others' feelings. Okay, so this, know the requirements, is the first key. Okay, so put a 1 by know the requirements, because now we're going to talk about another key. The second key we're going to talk about is, we're going to put a 2 here. Choose the right response. Choose the right response Learning how to be a competent communicator is increased by your knowledge of how effective communication functions. For example, competent communicators recognize that there are appropriate and inappropriate responses to specific situations. As you increase your knowledge of communication, you will broaden your communication options. Imagine a 2-year-old child who knows how to use only 10 words. He is limited greatly in the ways he can express himself. He might be able to ask for water, but he cannot tell his parents that he prefers the taste of cold water to water that is lukewarm or hot. All he can do is cry when he's given lukewarm water. Likewise, adults who are unaware of their communication options are limited in the ways they can express themselves. By increasing their awareness of different communication options, they can increase their potential for communication competence. For example, there are many ways to respond to angry words from a friend or family member. Negative responses would be to ignore the person, insult the person, lash out at the person. What would you think? If somebody's angry with you, what would you do? I could see how ignore the person for a while and let them calm down. I wouldn't say ignore them forever, but if every time you say something they're just getting madder and angrier, it might be better to be quiet for a while and let them cool down. Or you could seek reconciliation through finding a solution agreeable to both people. With this goal in mind, you could respond with a kind word. You know, the Bible says, a soft answer turneth away wrath. So we could respond with a kind answer. Consider the real source of the anger. Ask the other person to sit down with you and discuss the problem calmly. Now, to discuss it, in order to discuss it, that means you're talking and you're listening. They say something, you repeat back to them, paraphrase it, what they said, and then you say something and they paraphrase what you said, and then they respond, so you're both listening. Unfortunately, the first list is illustrative of the communication repertoire many inexperienced or self-centered communicators use. Without the good communication skills available to them, they respond automatically to the emotion presented and are consequently unable to communicate successfully in a variety of situations, even if their intentions are toward cooperation and resolution. Okay, so choose the right response. One thing we need is we need to enlarge our vocabulary. Not only do we need to enlarge our vocabulary, we need to learn different ways to deal with different communication issues. Okay. So we need to learn different communication responses, I guess is how you would say it. Choose the right behavior. Okay, so number 3. Number 3 is going to be choose the right behavior. Understanding what behavior is appropriate in a particular context or situation is the next step in becoming a competent communicator. Responding to anger with anger may not be the right choice to make. Even if you want to communicate that you are angry, the right response is to be calm and collected. Don't The consequences of poor response could turn out to be worse than the initial offense. When considering how to respond in a situation, you should judge your choice against these criteria. Does my choice correspond with what I believe to be true? Does my choice help to bring about the desired outcome? Does my choice take into consideration the feelings and needs of the other person? Okay. Does it correspond to what I believe to be true? C-O-R-R-E, yeah. Does it correspond to what I believe? Does it help bring the desired outcome? You should be done writing all that. Does it take into consideration other people's feelings? Does it take into consideration others' feelings? The answer to the first question reveals whether or not the message is an honest one. Does it correspond to what I believe? The second question addresses whether or not your choice is appropriate for the situation. The third question determines whether or not your choice is appropriate and good for the other person. A number of other communication skills can be used to answer these questions. For example, listening carefully to what the other person is saying will help you determine the correct response. Listening to the other person is critical to selecting the best way to respond. Intrapersonal communication is also an effective tool in choosing appropriate behavior. Rehearsing alternate scenarios in your mind can help you decide which will have the best results. You might have two choices that are true, necessarily, and kind, but one might be better suited for the situation. A third communication skill that might help you make the most appropriate choice is taking the other person's perspective. And that's taking into consideration the other's feelings. That's taking the other person's perspective. That's what that means. By imagining how you might feel in a given situation, you may be able to determine which response is kind or necessary. Okay, a fourth key is simply practice. Practice, practice, practice. Practice or frequent use of communication skills will make you a more competent communicator. The way you get better is to put into practice the skills you have learned. Don't let initial failures discourage you. Continue to expand your knowledge of communication options and make careful, informed decisions on appropriate behavior. Soon you will be a more competent communicator. Okay. Number 5 is get feedback. Feedback. Feedback is an invaluable communication tool. When you use feedback, you watch and listen to the reactions of others, considering their response to your message. This enables you to be sensitive to how others receive your message, as well as helps you to fine-tune your behavior. People who use feedback to adjust their behavior tend to be more competent communicators. Okay, let's review. Before we do the problem set, let's review the main points of the lesson. In this lesson, you considered the keys to competent communication. You learned that a competent communicator is an honest, considerate communicator. He or she knows that both the situation and the people involved heavily influence the approach to communication. Additionally, a competent communicator responds appropriately to conflict by considering the needs of others and choosing not to react out of emotion. Okay. Go ahead and review the problems, study your notes, and answer these questions.